Dazzle Camouflage was a anti-surveillance tactic developed by the British Navy in World War I. It was a moment where you always knew that your enemy was watching you, and so the question became, how do you manage surveillance rather than avoid it? They decided to employ a bunch of Dada artists, and they painted the ships. And so they painted the ships in these brightly contrasting colors, and the idea wasn't to say, oh hey, this isn't a ship. The idea was to say, now it is very difficult to say how big the ship is, or where it is headed, or what our munitions or ammunition looks like, or how many people are on board. By World War II, this tactic had sort of fallen out of use, but it still remains this really interesting example of the military coming up with anti-surveillance tactics. I started thinking about dazzle camouflage. To me, even the term dazzle camouflage is a word that summons up things about queer culture, about fantastic displays of the body, about highly visible displays of the body. So the paper that I'm writing right now involves 3 different examples of dazzle camouflage, and these are pulled from pop culture or queer activism or queer art. So the first example is Chelsea Manning's Twitter feed. The trolling that Chelsea Manning receives on Twitter is constant, and it is sometimes very brutal and threatens violence. And no matter what, Chelsea Manning responds with an offer of hugs, an offer of support. She is sometimes very snarky, and she always has a lot of emoji. And so I started thinking about this as a form of dazzle camouflage because it is managing the scrutiny that she receives every day online. And she's managing it with this very confusing form of display, of visual aesthetic display. And it's meant to recognize her accusers and attackers, but without granting them any seriousness, without granting really what their arguments are, and instead it just sort of recognizes it and moves past it in this sort of confusing, hyper-visible display of emoji and what I would call dazzle. The second example that I talk about is what's called reading. And reading was a practice of drag queens insulting each other, often in a back and forth, call and response, highly personal form of attack. And the word attack is important here because from an outsider perspective, it might seem like drag queens reading is hyper aggressive, but actually from within the drag queen community, it's actually a form of solidarity building. I'm arguing that this highly visible form of wordplay between drag queens, the practice of reading, is another form of dazzle camouflage that confuses people who aren't in on the joke, who aren't in on the game, who aren't from that culture, and it sort of sidesteps and manages, but doesn't entirely avoid their surveillance or scrutiny. So the third example of dazzle camouflage that I've been thinking about has to do with art from visual artist Zach Blass, who is a queer scholar and activist and artist. And he has done 2 art projects that are really tied to anti-surveillance. The first is called Facial Weaponization Suite. And so this work came out at a moment when research that has since been sort of contested started to show that machine learning could identify queer people just by looking at their faces. If you as a queer person are living in a world that has a lot of facial recognition technology, the news that at any time someone could identify you as a queer person is pretty terrifying because it is a way of automating oppression or harassment or exclusion. So it's in this kind of context that Zach Blass first started thinking about facial weaponization suite. And what it is a set of masks that really distort your face, so much so that if you're wearing it, you're highly visible to people on the street around you, but you're completely invisible to facial recognition software. So, and they're very brightly colored, they're these like bright pink masks. So he's really playing with the idea of what it means to be hyper visible to the people who are in the same physical space as you, but invisible to facial recognition software. So what you really see across all of these different projects is a recognition that for many people on the margins, it is very difficult to avoid surveillance, and surveillance has real consequences. It has real consequences, particularly for queer and trans people of color. And so they're really an ideal group to sort of think about how are these different communities developing tools, developing coping strategies for living under conditions of surveillance. And then when you look at some of the practices that have emerged from queer people and communities, Some of those practices are highly visible. They're not meant to avoid surveillance. They're meant to play with it or subvert it or meet it with some incredibly fantastic, highly visual, very confusing display. And so you see in that a form of protest and also a form of collective solidarity. And that's what I'm really interested in. And I think it taps into what Dazzle Camouflage was first meant to do, which is to play with and be this incredibly highly visible display as a form of resistance and as a form of counter-surveillance.